Hi, I'm Kathy Burns with the Canton County Cooperative Extension Service.
And I'm Diane Mason with the Boone County Cooperative Extension Service. We're here to share information on food preservation in our series of canning, freezing, and drying foods.
Today we're going to talk to you about home canning. So what is home canning? It's actually the process of preserving food by placing it in a glass jar and heating it sufficiently to kill microorganisms that can cause food spoilage and might cause foodborne illness. We want to do it safely, we want to do it accurately because it can be deadly if it's not done correctly. We certainly don't want that. It's also a method used to preserve food, obviously. I can preserve some fresh produce today and have it good for a year or up to 2 years. We recommend using it within a year, but 2 is okay, just as long as the product has been done correctly. We're going to start by talking about food safety, and it's of course essential that we do everything in a very safe way. We need safe, clean utensils, countertops, jars, lids, everything needs to be washed with hot soapy water to begin with. And of course, starting with your hands. You're going to be washing your hands very often. That's important. You're also going to need to wash the produce that you're going to be canning. In most cases, we're doing produce. You might be doing meats and things like that, but we're going to really address produce today. We want to just wash that with water. You don't need soap, you don't need any other kind of additives. Mostly running cold water will get the process done correctly. If you've got a product that is firm, maybe you're going to do some whole tomatoes, you want to be sure, and you can rub those and just to make sure that they're really clean. That's very essential. If you need to sanitize, if you have maybe cut meat ahead of time, you can do that. It's a very mild bleach solution. We can help you with that if you need it. We want to remind you to use correct, safe, reliable information. We can provide that to you from the Extension Office. We're happy to give you those kind of publications. We have publications on general canning and then each individual group, if you're doing fruits, vegetables, meats, things like that. We are happy to provide you with those. You can also get them from the National Center for Food Preservation. They have great books and publications. They have a great website that can help you with info as well. Ball canning is a reliable source as well, and anything again from the USDA that is connected with Extension and National Center, any of those are great reliable sources. Just be careful of things that you might find on the internet. There's some things that sound great, they may sound a lot simpler, but they're not research based and they're not necessarily safe, and we certainly don't want to do that. We want to have a good product for you to enjoy and to be safe. And also remember that some techniques that maybe your grandmother did or maybe you did back in high school are no longer the correct way to do things. An example I could think of with that is making jams and jellies. When I first learned to make that, we would process the jams and jellies, we would make them on top of the stove, we'd fill our jars, and then we would melt paraffin on top, and that did a little bit of sealing. We now know that that is not a good way to do that kind of canning. That paraffin breaks, and the product has not been heated. So anything that we home can now must be processed, either in a boiling water bath or a pressure canner. The recipes are developed so that there's sufficient time for the heat to penetrate from the outside of that jar into the food and get it to a hot enough temperature for a long enough amount of time to make it safe. So again, just watch and make sure you have a newer recipe to follow. And also be reminded there are some things that you just can't can. If you're having trouble finding a recipe, first of all, call us at the Extension Office and we can help you. But some things are just not safe to can at home. You might find them on this shelf at the store, but we just don't have the equipment or the processes to do them safely at home. One that comes to mind is pureed pumpkin. You know, you can buy a nice can of pumpkin, you just can't do that at home, puree it and can it safely. It just takes way too long for the heat to penetrate and get it to a safe temperature. So we can help you can pumpkin chunks that you can puree later, but that's just an example of things that you have to watch. Another thing is salsa recipes. We all have our favorite salsas that we make, and just because you make a good salsa doesn't mean that it's necessarily safe to can. It's all about acidity and different things, and so again, we have some safe, reliable recipes for salsa that can be canned, and we are happy to provide you with those. There are 2 methods of home canning: boiling water bath and pressure canning. Again, follow your recipe to use the type of canning processing that is recommended. Boiling water bath canners, which are basically just big vessels with lots of boiling water, are used with what we would consider high acid foods. Tomatoes, when we acidify them, which we'll talk about in a minute, fruits, pickled products, jams and jellies, things like that. We call those soft spreads. Those are all done in a boiling water bath. They have higher acid, so the acid helps to combat the microorganisms that might grow. And then, of course, the heat from the boiling water. So as you know, water boils at 212 degrees. So whether I boil something for an hour or 10 hours, it's never going to get above 212 degrees. That's just the nature of the beast. So that works, again, well with high acid foods. If I have low acid foods, which would include most vegetables, meats, those kind of products, I need to move to the pressure canner. The way the pressure canner operates, between the pressure and the vacuum, it can get up to 240 degrees. So it can get to a higher temperature that will kill some bacteria that are not killed in the boiling water bath, and also some spores and just some other microorganisms that are a problem because we have a lower acid food that doesn't help combat that. So you will sometimes use your pressure canner. Again, you might have had a recipe that 30 years ago you did in the boiling water bath canner. There are some vegetables that come to mind that I know people used to always do that way. But we are all about pressure canner now. They need to be done that way so that it's good and safe. We don't want to have the risk of botulism, which is the big concern with home canned goods. So now it's time to gather all our equipment so we can get ready and do our canning process. Now, canning can take a long time. There's a lot of hot water. Often there's a lot of ice water, a lot of heat, and a lot of energy. So it helps to have all your equipment gathered to begin with so you're not searching for things and it can't interrupt your canning process. So let's look at these canners a little more closely. I've just got a couple pots here that would be very suitable for using for boiling water bath canner. This is probably the traditional one that most of us are used to seeing. It's a coated enamel. Works great. It's a nice big pot that can hold a lot of product. Next to it is just a smaller canner I have for doing smaller amounts. It's a big pot. It has a rack in it. Got to have some kind of rack. There's a large rack in this one. The smaller one that fits in here. You might even have a rack that is flat. Just anything to keep the jars off the bottom of the canner. We just don't want those jar bottoms right against the bottom of the canner because of all that intense heat. So that's why we have those. It kind of also helps with getting your jars in and out of there because they're going to be hot. You don't have to have a special boiling water bath canner as long as you have a pot with which you can put your jars in and allow the water to boil 1 to 2 inches above. That will work. And again, have some kind of rack in the bottom to keep those safe. Boiling water bath. So what that does, of course, is it transfers heat to the jars through the boiling water. And so there are very precise times for different products, and they might differ even among the same product. You might have tomato pieces that have one time. You might have whole tomatoes that have another time. So check and make sure you're using the correct one. We mentioned the pressure canner. This is our pressure canner. This is a dial gauge pressure canner. You might also have a weighted gauge. You might, either one will work fine. They just help you indicate the poundage of pressure that is used when you conduct your recipe. They also have a rack in the bottom. They're made from a heavy aluminum. They're kind of heavy to begin with, so you gotta have your muscles out when you do this because once you get this filled with jars, you have to be able to lift it. That's another thing about canning. It's nice to do with another family member because there is a lot of work involved and it is just a nice way, and sometimes you need somebody to help you out, maybe move your muscles. So these again are for our lower acid products because when we get this pressure canner going, it will get to 240 degrees and be a lot safer. The other one I have here is something that might be a little bit newer to some of you. This is called an atmospheric steam canner. So these have not been around for very long, but what they do, they are also used with higher acid products. So again, I cannot do vegetables or meats in here because with those products, I would need to do them under pressure. Because this again is just working off of boiling water. What it does is it has a smaller amount of water in the bottom, and it works off the steam that goes through the canner, and it heats the product. Now there's it's not a real simple process. You can't just take a regular pot and do the same thing. You saw that this one has an indicator on the dial, and when I heat my product in here with just a few inches of water in the bottom, I also have a rack and I put my jars on top. I put this on and I have to wait till my indicator gets to the zone of which it needs to be, and then I need to start timing. And of course it has to stay there the whole time. If it drops down, then I'm not doing this sufficiently. So they do save water. Again, it's the same products that you would do in a boiling water bath canner. The times are the same, but you just have to make sure that you have sufficient steam that stays as long as you need it for. These can only go for no more than 45 minutes because of the water evaporation. And if you're very vigorously boiling your water, it might go a lot quicker than that. So again, read the directions and just make sure you're doing them correctly. But either of these will work for high acid products, this for low acid products. There's lots of other equipment that you're going to need when you do your home canning. First are your jars. So you want to use a canning jar. No leftover product jars that you might have around that even fit the lids. That doesn't matter. They're still not suitable. These have been processed in a way that they can take that intense heat, and they can be used year after year after year. But you need to inspect them. Even if I get a new box of jars, or if I'm pulling them out of the attic or the garage, you want to inspect them. Make sure there's no little nicks or little scratches or even like a hairline crack in here, because not only could that break when you were processing, but it can interfere with the seal of the jar. So we want to make sure they're nice and smooth. Of course, they'll be nice and clean, and again, those can be used over and over. This is what we would call a wide mouth jar, and this is a regular mouth jar. It's a personal preference. These are both pint jars. It's just what you like. So to go along with those jars, we need some lids. And we want you to use these two-piece lids. They consist of what we would call some people call this the flat, or just the lid itself that fits onto the jar. These have to be changed every time you use them. These are not reusable. So you'll use it to can, you'll open your can, and then you discard it. But on top of that is the screw band. These can be used year after year after year. You just have to watch and make sure they don't get rust on them, because that can interfere with your processing as well. So those fit together. And so you can find them for the regular mouth, you can find them for the wide mouth jars as well. When you buy new canning jars, they will come with the jar, the lid, and the screw band. But after that, then you can just buy the flats or the lids themselves, because that's all you'll need to redo unless you need to replace some jars. So those are our jars that we're going to use. Then we need all these other things to help make the whole process a little bit easier. I'm just going to go around. We're going to start with paper towels. You're going to use paper towels when you wipe off the rims. You just are going to use paper towels anyway in general cleaning. You need to have some hot pads, of course, because you're going to might be pulling off a hot lid or moving a hot pan. Lots of nice clean towels that are ready to go. You'll need some kind of rack, or you could use towels, and this is used for resting our canned goods when we take them out of the canner and we're going to have them cool, and then we're going to leave them alone. Just getting them on a little rack can raise them a little bit and help them to cool a little bit more efficiently. So that's what that's for. This is what you would call a jar lifter. We got to have this when we can, whether we're boiling water bath canning or pressure canning, because this is used to lift the product in and out of the canner. Note that it has a coated edge and it has kind of a handle edge, and so this is the area that is a little more grippy. It will grip your jar. You don't want to grip it around the ring because it can easily slip. You want to go below that and just lift your product in and out of the canner. You're going to want some kind of ladle just for filling your jars. And along with that is a funnel. You can do it without a funnel, but it sure makes life a lot easier. What that's for, as you can imagine, I can put that on my jar and then just fill it. And then I can lift it gradually. There might be some product that falls back in, and then get ready to put my lid on. We know that when we're canning, we've got to check for headspace. Headspace is the amount of space that's between the top of the product and the very top of the jar. So headspace can vary, and it does vary for different products. For tomatoes, it's a half an inch. For these carrots, it's an inch, and you can probably see there's a difference in that. You don't want to get your tape measure out, right? So there is a tool to make your life easier for doing that. And that's what this is for. It has little 1/4 inch increments on it. So what I can do is rest it on the top rim of my jar and measure. So if, for example, my product says I need a half an inch of headspace, I'll take it down 2 steps, that's what I kind of call it, and measure, and the product should just come to the very top of that indicator. The other thing that you're going to use is what we call an air bubble freer. Now you can use the bottom of this, or I like to just keep a plastic cutlery knife around. I don't want to use metal because I don't want a chance nicking my jar. But what that's for is after I fill my jar, let's say I'm filling it with tomatoes, and I put it in there, there can be an air pocket in there. So after you fill your jar, you just kind of go around the inside with that. And that's what that is for. This you might find in some canning equipment. Most of us who've been canning for a while have these, but you know what? We don't need them anymore for canning. This is a magnet on the end of this wand, and that is used to be used for picking up these lids, because in the past it was recommended on the jar package that you heat these lids before you used them. So we would have a small pot that we would just put some warm water, never boiling, just simmering water, and we would put those lids in there, and then as we got ready to use them after we filled our jars, we would get in here and lift it with that. But you don't need that anymore. So it's got a little magnet on it. You can use it for other things around the house. The last thing I have here, just a couple other things, is another pot. This is just for extra water. In the boiling water process, sometimes when you boil a long time, that water, of course, will evaporate and the level can get down a little too far. So it's good to keep a pot of really hot water on your stove while you're processing, so you can always lift the lid and pour more water in should you need to. And the last thing is just another example of a rack. If you don't have a rack that came in your pot, this is actually just a cooling rack, but it will fit in some of the pots that I have. So it's just another thing that you can do if you don't have if your pot doesn't have a rack in it. Okay, just a couple other reminders. Your recipes might talk about altitude. Altitude is not an issue in Kentucky. We are primarily below 1,000 feet, so the timing in the recipes that you will find is correct. You don't need to do any kind of adjustments with that. Also, just going to give you a final reminder to use good product. We're doing a lot of processing, we're doing a lot of work, so we want to start with a good quality product. If our product is starting to go bad, it's just not the best, it's not going to get any better once I process it and put it in the jar and let it sit for 6 months or a year. So start with good quality product, don't waste your time. And again, enjoy this day, it's a good time. Some people find it very therapeutic. It's also good family time. You can always give people little jobs to help you with this. And you will certainly enjoy the fruits of your labor later on, and you'll appreciate the hard work you did, and I think your family will enjoy it. So good luck.
Hi, today we're going to talk about pressure canning. And pressure canning is used for low acid foods like vegetables, meats, and combination type foods. And it's required to get the temperature of the food up high enough to kill off any of the bad bacteria. But before we talk about pressure canners, I thought I'd talk to you about a couple of items that cannot be used to pressure can, even though they create pressure. And these are called pressure saucepans or pressure cookers. So this is a stovetop pressure cooker, and it does not regulate the temperature well enough. It only cooks at 2 different pounds of pressure, and neither one are appropriate for canning. use it on the stovetop. It's just not built to pressure can. This is a newer electric multi-cooker that also cooks at pressure. It does not serve as a pressure canner either. You need to be able to get at least 4-quart jars into a pressure cooker to be able to qualify as a pressure canner. So please do not can in either a stovetop or an electric multi-cooker. It's just not safe. Okay, so these are 2 different styles of pressure canners. There's also a third style called a metal on metal pressure canner. I do not have a sample of that, but there's no gasket involved in that one. These 2 are, this is called a weighted gauge canner. It has a weight on top that will jiggle. And this is called a dial gauge pressure canner. They work in similar ways. They both can process different amounts of food. But we'll just take a quick look at the parts of a pressure canner. So first off, we have our pot, and in that pot we have a rack, and the rack is put in the bottom to help keep the jars up off of the bottom so that they don't break as they're sitting and cooking on the bottom of the pan. We have a lid of some sort, and this lid will lock onto the pressure canner, and this lid happens to have a gasket, and the gasket is removable. When you check a pressure canner, you need to make sure that the gasket is flexible, that it doesn't have any nicks or cuts in it, and it fits into the lid. If you're ever buying replacement parts, you'll need to have the brand name and the model number of your canner so that you get the right replacement part. This particular model also has a safety fuse. This one just happens to be red. Sometimes they're black. Sometimes they have a little metal knob on them. These are also replaceable. This is a safety fuse, and if something were to happen where the pressure built up too high, this is actually designed to come out to let the pressure be released from the pot. It is replaceable. And then this happens to be our weighted gauge. And the weighted gauge canner has a 5, a 10, and a 15 on the particular gauge. And if your recipe tells you to cook it at 5 pounds of pressure, you put 5 down onto the vent port, and it will start jiggling when the pressure comes up to temperature. And it should jiggle 3 or 4 times a minute. You need to read the book that comes with your pressure canner to make sure that you know how often it needs to jiggle, but it will make some noise. So this is a weighted gauge pressure canner, 5, 10, 15 pounds of pressure. When you have a recipe for pressure canning, it will tell you what amount of pressure to use for the type of canner that you're using. So weighted gauge, this is a dial gauge pressure canner. And again, we have our pot. We have a rack in the bottom, just like the other one. And we put this in the bottom, keep the jars up. We have a gauge, and I always ask people if it looks like a speedometer, and it does, and this goes from 0 to 15 or 20 pounds of pressure, and it will build and it will show you what the pressure is. It also has a vent port, and this is called a dead weight, and the dead weight sits on the vent port. It basically just locks off the steam from coming out of the canner so it can build pressure. This canner happens to have a safety fuse or safety valve also. This one happens to be black. It will come out if something happens. It's designed to do that. It also has a lid lock, and this lid lock is designed to come up so that when this is up, you cannot get the lid off of the canner. That's one of the safety features built into it. So you'll see that come up when we come up to pressure. This also has a gasket, and this gasket can come out also, and you just need to check it every time before you use it. One other thing you need to check before you start to use your canner is the vent port. I always hold it up to the light, and I look through to see if I can see light through the vent port. If I can't see light through it, the steam can't get out, and that can cause me problems. If I happen to have some type of clog, I will take a unbent paper clip to clean it. Don't use a toothpick or anything that could break off in there, or then you will definitely have a clogged vent port. So just be aware of that. There's another type of canner out there. I don't have a sample of it, but I do have the weight for it. This is an older model, but if you need 5 pounds of pressure, you use one small piece. This would be 10 pounds of pressure, and this would be 15 pounds of pressure. And it sits on top of the vent port, quite similar to the one, and it will rock. It will rock and jiggle also. And this goes to a very specific model. So those are our types of pressure canners. Usually, with this size of pressure canner, I can stack jars. I can stack pint jars in here, and so I can put one row of pint jars on the bottom. I just happen to have like a cake rack, or I can buy a second rack, regular rack, to put on top of those jars. I'll put this up so that the little feet are sticking up instead of down directly on a lid. Put this in, and then I can stack a second row of jars on top. So I can get, I think it fits like 15 jars in this particular canner at one time. And remember, one of the reasons is that we're cooking with pressure, so the whole thing is at the same pressure. When we're talking about pressure canners, if you're looking to purchase one, they'll probably run in the $80 to $100 range, depending on where you find it. That's pretty standard. You need to decide if you want a weighted gauge or a dial gauge, and that's personal preference. They both work just fine. So one difference between water bath canning and pressure canning: water bath canning, you need a pot that will allow you to have water 1 to 2 inches, boiling water 1 to 2 inches above the jars. Pressure canning, on the other hand, we're cooking with steam essentially, and we only need usually about 2 inches of water in the bottom of our container. So I've put about 2 inches of water in the bottom of my pot, and I have the rack on the bottom. So I'm really kind of ready to go, although we're not going to put it on the stove yet because I don't have my product ready. But then this lid will lock on. And usually on each lid there is some type of marking. This one happens to have a little arrow on the lid. And there's also an arrow to match it to, or some type of marking on the handle. So all you do is you match the marking on the lid to the marking on the handle. Line those up, and then turn the lid to lock it down. And sometimes it can be a little bit challenging to, especially if you have a new gasket, it might be a little bit hard to move, but you really shouldn't have to force it closed. If you have to force it closed, it usually means you don't have the lid on straight. So some people will put a little bit of oil or Vaseline on the gasket to make it move a little easier, and you can certainly do that if you want to. So that's how you open and close the lid. Very simple and easy. So if you're out at a yard sale and you happen to see a pressure canner for sale, sometimes you can get a really good bargain. Other times you'll get a pot with a lid that doesn't work. So I have seen people where they'll bring it in and all of the parts are there, but all of the parts are down in the pot because somebody knew it didn't work, and the hole where the gauge screws in is been made so much bigger because it's been used so much that the pressure gauge no longer fits in the hole. So there's no way for it to build pressure. So if you are looking for a deal and you go to a secondhand store or to a yard sale, just really be careful about what you're buying and know that sometimes you're going to spend $5 on a big pot, and be okay with that. If you want to buy new, like I said, they'll be between $80 and $100 usually. Now we're going to can some green beans, and green beans need to be pressure canned. No matter how your grandmother or mother ever did it, they still need to be pressure canned. We're a lot smarter today than we used to be. So I'm going to show you two different packing methods. One is called raw pack and one is called hot pack. So I'm going to kind of do them simultaneously, but you'll be able to keep up. First off, I am going to add salt to my green beans. So it takes 1/2 teaspoon per pint or a teaspoon per quart. And we are using canning salt today. I do usually put it in the bottom of the jar because if I don't, I forget if I did it or not. So if I put it in the bottom, I know it's already taken care of. So that just happens to be my 1/2 teaspoon of canning salt. I have some green beans here today. I've already broken some. They should be in about a 1-inch piece. And a 1 inch is about to the first knuckle on your index finger is about 1 inch. So break those into about 1-inch pieces. When you're selecting green beans, you don't want to can product that's not quality. So this one really has no redeeming value in terms of a canned product. So I'm just going to put that in my discard pile. canning, drying, or freezing food does not improve its quality. It just preserves it for use later. So if you preserve a quality product to start with, you'll end up with a better product in the end. So as I take a look at this particular green bean, it looks like it probably has some insect or animal damage to it, and it's starting to rot around where the animals were into it. And this end of the green bean really didn't fill out or finish maturing. So this green bean really wouldn't be one you want to preserve. Here's another one, again, the same thing. It kind of has some rot on one end. If I wanted to, I could, but it has a little bit better shape here. I could break this off and still save the one end. Usually where they've come off the vine, there'll be a dry part, and you'll just break that off or cut that off. You don't want to preserve something that's already started to dehydrate. And then I clip off the stem end there and break these into pieces. And I have these all ready to go. They've been washed. I washed them in cool water, rinsed them several times, and so we're ready. So we're going to do a hot pack right now. And to do a hot pack, I need to have boiling water, and I have that here on my stove. I have my green beans ready, and what I will do is I'm just going to put some green beans into my boiling water. And I don't want to overload the pot because I want it to still be hot, but I don't want to put so few in that I wouldn't get enough in the jar either. So I'm just going to kind of guesstimate how many beans I'm going to need here. I'm going to put the lid back on, and I want to cook these green beans for 5 minutes, and that will come back up to a boil here. So I'm going to set my timer for 5 minutes. Okay. While we're waiting for those to cook, we're going to do a raw pack. And if you'll remember, I put salt in the bottom of my jar. My jars are hot right out of the dishwasher. I do want to have a clean, hot, a warm jar. It doesn't have to be burning hot. You can do that either by washing them in soap and water in your sink, and then putting them in another pot of water just to stay warm, or you can do it in your dishwasher, whichever works in your world. So to raw pack my vegetables, raw pack my green beans, I will take my jar, and I've done nothing but wash these green beans and snap them. I'm going to put them into my jar. I usually try to shake it around a little bit to try to avoid big spaces in between the beans. And the advantages of raw packing are that I can handle things very easily, and I can move things around. It's not hot. The jar is warm, but nothing else is very hot. I want to push down on these a little bit. And I can always take a plastic utensil, maybe like just a plastic knife, or they call these bubble freers or bubble wands. I can use this too to get down here, and I sort of look around and kind of see if I can move things around a little bit just with this. I want to leave 1 inch of headspace. So what I do is I kind of look at this pretty good, and this particular bubble wand has 1/4 inch markings, so I want to be sure that nothing is touching anything that's 1 inch. And right now I have green beans that are touching, so I'm going to take out a few of those green beans because I want to make sure that I leave that 1 inch headspace. The 1 inch headspace lets the air escape from the jar and lets the jar get hot all the way in the center like it needs to kill off any of the terrible germs or bacteria that may be lurking in there. So there's my jar ready to go. I'm going to do one more of a cold pack or a raw pack since I have green beans. And again, I'll shake it around a little bit. I kind of look at it just to make sure I got them all down in there. I can press down in on them. I don't want to smash them, but I do want them to be, fit in there pretty tight. They will expand while they're cooking, but then they will shrink back down as they've cooked. So again, I'll check my headspace to make sure I don't have anything within my 1 inch range. So I'm pretty good on that. Now, you need to have hot water, just plain hot water. You can either boil it on the stove in a pan, or we have wonderful electric teapots with hot water. And I'm just going to fill my jar. I'm going to fill it up to 1 inch, to the 1 inch headspace again. Again, I don't want my water, I don't want my green beans, I don't want anything touching above that headspace. And now that I have the water in here, I definitely want to go around and make sure that I get out any extra air. Okay, so we'll double check here again. Looking pretty good on this. Okay. This one, I'll add my water to this one. I'm going to set this aside so you can see. Oh, I overfilled that one. I already know that. I watched myself do it. But that happens sometimes. So I'm just going to make sure I press these down. And then I'm just going to take a little spoon, my little plastic spoon here, and I will dip off that water and bring my water level back down to where it needs to be. Get everything back down to that 1 inch. And this is just plain water. Nothing special about it, just plain hot water. Looks like I'm about back down to my 1 inch there. Yep, I'm looking pretty good there. So I'll press those around. Again, I will make sure I get all of the air out of there. Okay, we're going to finish up our raw packed green beans. Remember, I put the salt in the bottom, I put the green beans in, I added hot water, and now I need to take a damp paper towel and wipe around the upper rim of my jar so that I get any little bits of salt or any little bits of vegetable off of the rim of the jar so that I ensure a good seal. Then I have my lid, which has a sealing gasket on it. Put that down, and I'm going to fingertip tighten the lid on. I don't want to crank it really hard because I risk the lid buckling after it's processed, during the process. So it used to be that you had to warm these lids to get the sealing compound to work, but the manufacturers did learn that you don't have to do that now, and so it will tell you right on the box that you no longer have to warm the lids before you put them on the jar. So I'm going to set these aside for just a minute because now I want to show you how to hot pack a jar. So again, I put my salt in the bottom of the jar. I have a wide mouth jar. I have a nylon ladle because I don't want to risk damaging the jar with metal. So these are my green beans that have been cooking for 5 minutes. And on this one, I'm actually going to use the liquid that they were cooked in. So I'm just going to spoon as many of the green beans into the jar as I can. And usually with green beans, I don't use a funnel. You can put a funnel on your lid or on your jar and use that to help get product in. I'm going to do okay just this way. So I'm going to get all the solids in. And remember that my headspace is still 1 inch. Doesn't matter, it's still 1 inch. One of the challenges is these jars get hot, so just be cautious and very careful. Again, I want to move my green beans around so that I avoid any air pockets. I can kind of press down on them. I don't want to smash my green beans, but I want to get them, I want to fill my jar. I don't want to have a bunch of airspace in my jar. So I've got quite a bit there. I can still fit more in. I do that. If I overfill a little bit, I can always pull a few out. So again, I'll just press down a little and run my knife around the outside of the jar to get rid of any big air bubbles or air space. I know I've already overfilled this some, I can tell, without even checking. So I'll pull a few of these out. I got ambitious, didn't I? I like green beans, so I want as many in the jar as I can get. So I'll check my headspace, make sure I'm okay on the inch. Then I don't have my water up there yet, so I'm just going to take some of this cooking liquid and put it in my jar up to the inch. And again, I'm just going to double check. All right, so that's my hot pack jar. Take my paper towel again, wipe off the rim of the jar, put my lid on, put my ring on, and fingertip tight. Woo, that one's warm. Okay, so I'm ready to put these in the canner. And I'm going to move these over. I don't think I have enough green beans for another jar, so I'm ready to go. This is my pressure canner again. I've had it sitting on the burner. I've been warming the 2 inches of liquid that's in the bottom of it. It is not boiling, but it is getting warm. You can probably see a little bit of steam coming out. And I can just going to take my jar straight up and over into my canner. All right, I don't have to worry about my jars falling over because I don't have that much water in. So if I were using a boiling water bath canner, I might have to fill in the jar in the spaces with some empty jars, but I don't have to do that with my pressure canner. So remember, I have my lid with the mark on it. I have my handle with the mark on it. I'm just going to turn this so that it seals. And we talked about this vent port, and I need to see steam coming out of this vent port at a steady stream for 10 minutes before I do anything else. So we're just going to wait. I have it on high. I have the burner on high, and we're going to wait until we see steam coming out of the vent port for 10 minutes. Okay, while we're waiting for our pressure canner to start to vent, and venting means that we'll see steam coming out of the vent port at a steady stream. It should sort of look like a tornado coming up. And then we'll have to time it for 10 minutes. And that makes all of the air that's in this canner escape and will allow it to register properly on the pressure. While we're waiting for that, I want to cover a couple of things. And one is that this is a dial pressure canner. So when we do start canning, I need to take it to 11 pounds of pressure for a certain amount of time. If I were using the weighted gauge canner, it would be on 10 pounds of pressure, because if you remember, I can only use 5, 10, or 15 pounds of pressure for that. How do I know that? Well, I know that because in the recipe shows me how long I need to do each step. It tells me how many pounds of pressure for what method of pressure canning I'm using, and it tells me how long I need to leave the jars under pressure. So always look for quality recipes. Another thing I want to cover is hot pack versus raw pack. And as we saw, hot pack, I heat up my food and then I pack hot food into a hot jar. Raw pack, I don't cook the food and I put it in a jar and I add hot water to it. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. A raw pack, I can handle the jar. I don't have to have another pot of water sitting on the stove boiling or have any other type of water going. Some things that probably would benefit from raw pack, like tender vegetables, asparagus, those types of things. If you think about pre-cooking asparagus, that would get quite limp and would break down further. Hot packing an item, you'll get more air out of the actual product, so you'll be able to get a little bit more product in the jar. And they do say that a hot pack provides or gives you a better end product. So kind of have to decide how much room you have in your kitchen and what you want to do. And also, the recipes will tell you whether you should hot pack or raw pack. If there are no directions for hot packing, or if there are no directions for raw packing, then you should hot pack, and vice versa. Another thing about these recipes is if I am canning and there are no directions for a boiling water bath canner, there are only directions for a pressure canner, it means that you have to pressure can the product. There's one item I can think of that you can do either, and that is tomatoes. You can generally do tomatoes either boiling water bath or pressure canner. But as a general rule, your directions are going to tell you one method or the other. And there's no switching that out for safety. If you can see our canner right now, this lid lock has come up, and that's quite normal. It's just telling us that right now I can't take this lid off even if I tried. it's a safety mechanism and it's ready to go. I don't see steam. There is steam coming out, and it's difficult to see in this room, but it is coming out at a steady stream. So I'll set my timer for 10 minutes. And after that 10 minutes is up, then we'll start the processing. Again, this gets all of that excess air out of this canner and lets the pressure gauge actually record at the proper pressure. Okay, our 10 minutes is up, and we have been venting our canner for 10 minutes. So now I can take this dead weight and put it on the vent port, closing that off. So now I will start building pressure. And it's going to take a little bit of time. I still have my stove on high. I'm still cooking on high because I want to build this pressure up to 11 pounds of pressure. Usually when I get to about 9, I'll turn my burner down. I want to go to 11. I don't want to go to 10. I don't want to go to 12 or 13. I really want to go to 11. One thing about pressure canning is I'll go to 11. If I go less than 11, I have to bring it back to 11 and start my timing all over again. So if I go less than 11 for a minute, I have to bring it back up and let it go and start all over again. If I go higher, it's not a problem other than I'm over processing my food. So I really want to keep it at 11. Sometimes if it goes up to 13 or 14, it's too much. And you just have to regulate that with your stove. Generally, I start on high, and I know on my stove, I'll go to 4, and that will regulate my temperature. You have to play with your own stove. Some stoves are stronger than others, or more hotter than others, I guess would be the right word. So we're going to keep an eye on our pressure gauge until we get to about 9 or 10, and then I'm going to turn this stove down, and we're going to go to 11, and we're going to hold it there. And according to my recipe, we're going to hold it there for 20 minutes. Okay, we're on about 7 or 8 pounds of pressure now. And while we're waiting for that to go ahead and continue coming up, and before I turn the pressure down just a little bit, or the stove down just a little bit, I want to talk just a minute about using a flat top cooktop or a ceramic cooktop for canning. And this type of cooktop is quite popular now. You need to read the manual or call the manufacturer of your cooktop to find out if there is a specific burner that is appropriate for canning. One thing about canners is that they're bigger than the burner. And because they're bigger, they disseminate the heat out beyond where the burner has been tempered. And so you risk breaking your flat top cooktop. If you look at the bottom of this canner, it's solid all the way around. It's flat from one side to the other. So if this were on a burner, it would disseminate heat all the way out to the edge of this pan and risk damaging your cooktop. This canner, on the other hand, has what I would call a little sandwich on the edge or on the bottom, so that this bottom part sits on the burner, but then there's a little bit of air gap between the burner or the stovetop and the bottom of the pan. So this one is still going to disseminate heat, but certainly isn't going to do it like the other one is. So something to think about if you have a flat top. But we do recommend that you call the manufacturer or look at your stovetop guide to check to see if there's a specific burner that's been tempered for canning. The other side of it is, and I've had a lot of people say, well, I can and I do it on my flat top and I never had a problem. And that could be very true. But if you are truly canning and you're doing it all day long and you're just constantly doing canning, you're building up a lot of heat and you're really working on that burner. So just be aware of that before you start. Some people will buy an old-fashioned or an eyelet type stove, put it in their basement or put it out on the back porch or someplace where it's a little bit cooler, even if they're going to get really serious about canning, because then you don't have to worry about the breaking your good stove top. All right, so our timer went off. We've had our green beans in for 20 minutes, and I turned the stove off. I turned the burner off, and now I need to take my canner, and it can be quite heavy, and because I have an electric stove and because it's a flat top cooktop, I need to lift it up and move it over off of the burner so that it can start its cool down process. So I'm just going to gently move this over to a space that has no heat under it. Then I have to just wait for the pressure to come back down to 0. Depending on how many jars you have in here, depending on the product you have in here, and depending on the construction of your canner, this can take anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. Newer canners probably will take a little bit less time because the wall construction on the canner is slightly thinner. Older canners, if you have a really beefy old-fashioned canner, it can take up to an hour. So I can't do anything to speed it up. I can't put cold water on it. I can't move my dead weight. I can't do anything because if I change the pressure inside the container too fast, I risk breaking my jars or pulling liquid out or pulling product out of my jar. So just have to be patient and let it sit. So that's what we're going to do. Just be patient. We pressure canned our beans for 20 minutes. We took it off of the burner and set it aside so that it could just sit and come down to 0 pounds of pressure on its own. It has done that, so we're on 0 pounds of pressure. Our lid lock has dropped back down, which is another indicator that we have no pressure in the canner right now. I'm going to take this dead weight off, and then I have to let my canner sit for 10 minutes before I open the lid. And that just makes sure that all of the pressure is out of the canner and that my jars are having a little bit of a chance to calm down. If I were to open the lid right now, even though there's no pressure in the canner, that water in those jars is just boiling really fast. And if I take them out at this point, I risk pulling water out of the jars because they haven't sealed yet. They're not going to seal until I pull them out of the canner. So 10 minutes, we just have to wait. It's a lot of waiting and a lot of water with canning sometimes. So our timer, we've gone for 10 minutes. We've let our canner sit. Everything is good. And now I can take the lid off and remove my jars of green beans. So I'm going to twist this lid to unhook it, unlatch it. And I'm going to turn it toward you in the camera so that I don't get the steam bath. And steam is very hot and will burn. So just be careful when you take the lid off. And remember, everything is still very hot. Just set this to the side. Take my jar lifter. And again, with the jar lifter, you want to use the coated end to lift up your jars. And you want to reach down and get onto the jar, not on the lid. So I'm lifting the jars straight up and over. They may have some water on them. And if they do, that's okay. I'm still going to go straight up and over. And if you look at this, you're going to see that there's water boiling in those jars, and that's totally normal. So up and over, right onto a cooling rack. Okay, our beans have come out of the pressure canner. I've put them on a cooling rack. There's a towel underneath just to catch any drips or anything. And what I need to do is I need to let these sit just like they are for 12 to 24 hours. That will help ensure that I get a good seal and that all is well with my green beans. One thing you might notice with these green beans, some of them, this is the hot pack that we did, and this jar is full and the beans are down all the way to the bottom. This is the raw pack jar that I did, and you'll see that the beans are kind of floating up in the water. These will actually drop down and they'll look quite similar when it's all over. So this is totally normal. Okay, now that your canning is complete, I want to cover a few tips for post-canning activity. Number one, you may find that right after you do can, and this jar is still a little bit warm, you'll find that some of your items are sort of floating in the jar, and that's normal. After it sits for its required 12 to 24 hours, those items will drop down and be under the water if there's still plenty of water in the jar. After they've sat for 12 to 24 hours, you'll have cool jars and you'll be able to handle them. The first thing you want to do is to remove the ring. and take a look at your jar. You can look at your jar and see how high your water level is and if your product is still under the water. If it's not, it's okay. Don't take the lid off and try to add water or do anything. It just means that if I have this jar and another one where the water level's okay, I would use this jar first. If it's really, really low, again, I would just use it first, and I'd probably try to use it within maybe a month or so. It's just going to deteriorate faster. After I take the ring off, I just want to take a nice wet towel and wipe my jar off, clean the top off, and that just gets rid of any sediment or anything that might be on the jar that would attract bugs in storage. So I'm going to wipe it off. I always want to label my jar. I usually either use a permanent marker, or you can buy stickers that you can write the name of the item and the date that it was canned, because after you do this for a few years, you may forget when you did things. So always date your jar. We do recommend that you use the product within 1 year, no more than 2 years. And as it's sitting on the shelf, you want to store it in a cool, dry place, not in the direct sunlight, and you can line your jars up. If you'll notice, this particular jar, this is looks like a peach jam or a peach jelly, a peach jam. You'll see that the top part of this jam is starting to darken. This jam is over 1 year old, and it's somewhat normal for that to happen, but it's not normal for it to happen at this rate. And the reason, one of the reasons this is starting to darken is that the headspace of this particular jar was incorrect. For jams and jellies, the headspace is 1/4 inch, and this one looks like it maybe was about 1 inch or a little bit more. So maybe it was the end of the run and they didn't want to not can something. It's better to go ahead and eat that product than to can a partial jar. You can't can partial jars and get a good quality product. You won't get all of the air exhausted out of the jar. So that's an example of something to be concerned about. If I saw this on my shelf, I would discard this jar. I would not use this because I don't know how far down the product has gone to deteriorate. Another thing, sometimes we wonder if something didn't seal. That's another thing, is you can check the seal on this. If I push down on this lid should not move up and down. I should not be able to pop the lid off just by using my fingers. If I can, it means that it didn't seal, and I have 24 hours to either reprocess the food or do something with it. So I have several choices. I can reprocess the food, and by reprocessing, I mean I take it out of this jar, I replace the lid, I bring it back up to temperature, I repack it, and I reprocess it exactly like I would have with the normal product. So if I processed it for 20 minutes, it has to be processed again for 20 minutes. That means it's going to be really overcooked. I can empty it out of this jar into a freezer container and put it in the freezer for storage, or I can put it in the refrigerator and use it within the next couple of days. So I do have some options. If I have a lot of jars that didn't seal, I'm going to look to myself to figure out what I did wrong. Were my lids new lids? Did I use the proper process? Did I process for the proper amount of time? Did I wipe the rim of the jar before I put the lid on? Because sometimes you can get little pieces of food or salt. Did I check the jar before I used it to make sure there weren't any nicks or cracks in the rim of the jar? All of those can affect whether my jar seals or not. So always look to yourself. Also, if I have water that's low, if I have a low water line, like on the green beans I had, maybe it's because I didn't let the pressure canner come down to pressure on its own. Maybe I had the pressure way beyond the 11 pounds of pressure 10 or 11 pounds of pressure that was called for in my pressure canner. There are several reasons why I might pull liquid out of a jar. Remember that when the jar is in the canner, it has not yet sealed. It does not seal until it comes out of the canner and has time to sit for 12 to 24 hours. So I'm going to put these up on my shelf, and I'm going to enjoy the fruits of my labor for the next year. And as I'm thinking about next year for canning, I will plant and be prepared with my jars and everything before I get started. So I encourage you to can quality produce. Have all of the equipment that you need before you get started, and then follow the recommended recipes that have been research-based and from a quality source, whether it's the Ball Blue Book, the Cooperative Extension Service, the Center for Home Food Preservation. We always encourage people to use those resources for canning. And enjoy, because this in January is yummy, yummy, yummy.
We hope you find all this information to be helpful. We've given you a lot of details, but we know sometimes there can still be questions. So feel free to call us or email us, and we're happy to hear from you. Happy preserving!